Hi, everyone. This is Chapter 3 Facilitating Social Unity in a Diverse Society for Counseling 4000. All right, introduction. We all have stereotypes and biases, so we just need to state that, and you need to admit to it as well. We make decisions about other people based on differences, right? I always like to talk about the fact that we're all raised by people, right? And those people saw the world in a specific way, and they see the world in a specific way because they were raised by people who saw the world in a specific way, right? And as we get older, we'll start to meet people, we'll start to learn about the world, hopefully, if you are out there and about meeting different people and doing things as opposed to just being at home, rotting at home or whatever like that, right? We will notice that some of the stuff that we learned when we were younger are not correct or not true. Okay, it's not because your parents hated you or the people who raised you hated you. That's how they saw the world, and so they probably raised you that way because that's how they saw the world, and they thought they were protecting you. So it's not about attacking, the older generations when it comes to that. I just want to make sure that we're aware of that. Okay, all right. Our decisions feel natural to us because we were raised that way. We've seen it for a long, long time. Usually from our childhood to becoming a teenager. We are not aware of the role prejudice is playing in our thinking or behavior. And that is true. Growing up, I just assumed certain groups of people were bad because that's what my parents told me they were bad or they were scary or whatever it is. Professionals have a sense of self awareness. So, as professionals, we're learning about this right now, right? That you do have biases, you do have stereotypes in your head, and there is an inclination or likeliness to approach some people differently because of that. Okay. So the most important thing is to not say, I don't have any biases, because when you say that, we're all like, sure, whatever. What we really want you to say is, we were raised with biases, but they're not necessarily true. And we will keep that in mind when we work with people in a professional setting. Step 1, take inventory of your prejudices, stereotypes. Think about how they can affect how you relate to others in the future. And that's true, right? So if you keep these specific stereotypes or prejudices, you're going to maybe treat people less than you, right? Or rudely, or, both of them, obviously. So you want to start to be aware of it. Okay. Number 2, accept who you are and where you are. So go towards something better. We're hoping that you're going to be a better person now that you are aware of those things. And 3, moving to a healthier place. So decide what you are going to do about it, right? So if there are certain things that you're raised with, and you want to see, how can I find out if this is true or not, you have to openly discuss these things, obviously with the right people, right? You don't want to talk to people who are going to gossip and stuff like that. But in the classroom, in a professional setting, and if you state it clearly, I'm like, I'm processing this information, and I wanted to hear other people's perspectives, let's say, right? Or let's say, watch a movie about things like that, and then try to help see how other people see this specific topic as well. All right, professional imperatives. So basically professional requirements, okay? These are things that are really important that we want to do. Give competent professional service to all that qualify for the services. So that means that you're going to offer all the help that you can, regardless of who they are, race-wise, ethnicity, religion, or their gender identity. Anything else would be, or anything less would be considered unethical. Okay. Within the field, we're talking about code of ethics, right? So in our field, we really want to make sure that you are not being discriminatory. Psychology codes of ethics do not engage in unfair discrimination based on age, gender identity. So the difference between those two things is gender is typically male or female, or maybe even non-binary. There's also gender identity. So that is the person, maybe a person who's transgender. Okay. All right. Or non-binary as well. Race, ethnicity, culture, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, socioeconomic status. That means about how wealthy or not wealthy you are. Are you living in poverty? Any basis prescribed by law. So it's really covering a lot of things, right? And we want to make sure that the service providers who are going to get a degree from an accredited university, that they understand that you're not supposed to prevent people from receiving services because of one of these things. Some history to help us out. So this is going to be a really quick history about the world, okay? Okay. In the 1400s to the 1500s, this is medieval times in Europe, kings were given the right by God to rule over others. And this happened in other countries as well, okay? We can think about the pharaohs in Egypt and stuff like that as well. In the 1600s to the 1800s, Age of Enlightenment. So Enlightenment is kind of a fancy word for basically an age of education, okay? You're like, whoa, that's enlightenment right there. Okay, the big number one thing was the printing press. Before the printing press, if you wanted a book, someone had to write the book out for you. Okay, so very few people ever saw a book, or then therefore few people read. This is why we have murals, which are photos to tell us a story, because people could not read. Okay, once a printing press came out, and then you can print books much more easier and faster, you can pass it along to people. And so people were learning how to read so they could read these books. So when people are educated in this way, they'll start to think more and ask questions, right? They can reason and make sense of things, talk about science and government, and even questioned the power of the church now during this time period. And then as the Age of Enlightenment happened, two groups emerged. The wealthy elite should rule, so that means, so kind of like the king, right? The rich people would rule the world, or the educated elite would rule the world. So those are people who are educated, who were able to think and reason and stuff like that. So those two groups started to see which one is better when it comes to running a society. In the 1700s, there were revolutions. In America, what happened was we started to go look into the wealthy elite, which are, sometimes wealthy elite are also educated as well, right? But also part democratic, which means part for the people. France did not believe in religion. This is very secular, right? And then democratic as well. So you start to see that as people become more educated, they'll start to decide, for their government, their society, what would be the best way to rule, or what was the best way to have a country work or operate. In America, there were no kings, but the elites would run things. So elites might be people who are intelligent, but also wealthy as well. Slaves were considered 3/5 of a person. So right there, even though we were thinking more progressively, right, there were still things that were problematic, which is that they saw black people, especially slaves, as not a human being, less than human, which means that 3/5, so it's kind of like half of a person. Half of a black person equals to one person. That means that you need to have about basically 2 black people to make 1 white person. Do you see how that shows that they saw black people as less than, right? The Senate is where the elites would meet, and we think about the Senate now. And then during this time period, we also start to see the need or the call for universal education, which basically means that everyone should have a basic understanding, a basic experience of education in their lives. The House of Representatives represented the everyday person who would conduct business. So now if you think about our history, you know how we're divided into 3 branches, right? One is Congress. And so what happens is typically there are laws and legislation that is proposed by the House of Representatives, and then it moves into the Senate, then they vote as well. And then once that happens, then, it basically goes into law. But there's also, if there's questions about these laws or ethical issues, then we go to the other branch, which is the judicial, or the Supreme Court and all the courts below it, right? And then there was a third component, which is the executive, which is the president. It was created in the Constitution with guardrails. Guardrail means there are limits to presidential power, so that one person doesn't become the king, like we typically would not want in America, because that's not how our society was founded upon. So do you see the 3 and how it all works together to try to balance each other out, so that no one gets too much power, and then basically kind of takes charge of everything in an unjust, unfair, illegal way. All right, since the American Revolution, the time period, during this time period, it was an experiment, right? We're like, hey, let's see what happens when we start a new country, a new society, a new government in a specific way. We still have a democracy to this day, so that's good, right? That we started it in a way and it's still working, which is amazing. Some still hold grudges, though. There are some people, obviously, in a society who are not going to be happy with that. And so they might still discriminate and they might still have prejudice, right? But we have to address those things. We ask ourselves, should we all be equal? Do all receive a good education? Should new arrivals be isolated and treated as outsiders? So that means immigrants and stuff like that. Should we celebrate different cultures and collaborate? Are some people better than others and deserve more power? So these are questions that people started to ask, to see what would be the best for our society. And the Civil War was a period of time where people were trying to figure out and understand that. Whereas one group believed in slavery, whereas the other group did not, right? Or at least that's like a really surface level conversation. It's much more deeper than that, obviously. And then, of course, a Reconstruction period where we're trying to, again, build America into this idea of what we want. So in modern America, in the textbook, it actually brings up a very specific thing. We are the most powerful country in the world. Let's make sure that you all understand that, right? America is the most powerful country in the world. And yet we're not perfect, and we will never be perfect, right? Here's an example. An incident of a protest with some legislator participating. So basically there was a racial protest, right? And there were 2 black legislators and 1 white woman legislator who participated in this protest, okay? The 2 black legislators were expelled or removed. However, the white woman was not removed, even though all 3 were doing exactly the same thing. So when we look at that, we start to go, hey a minute, why is it that the black people were removed and the white woman was not? While we make progress, open doors, and improve opportunities, there are some who think that only certain people should have a voice and be included. And this happened in 2023, so only a couple of years ago. They're known as the Tennessee Three. I linked an article about it just in case if you wanted to read about it, so that you understand. You're like, wow, we've moved so much in this world. At the same time, we don't, right? And we need to understand that this still exists to this day. Okay, why diversity, equity, and belonging are important. How is diversity our strength? Do you get along better with your neighbors and your coworkers if you can't understand each other or share no common values? Some people might think, or wonder that, right? And we'll have a conversation as we go through to discuss all these differences and questions that we have. All right, greater innovation. In April of 1933, Nazi government said law to fire anyone in the government position that had one grandparent who was Jewish. Okay, guess what? Einstein is partly Jewish. So he moved to America in 1933 because the government there said, we don't want you, right? Einstein is a brilliant person, right? And so with brilliant people gives us, greater innovation. So all these people who were intellectuals, educated elites, remember we were talking about that before, were no longer welcome in a country. They moved to the US, the Great Britain, other areas, and then they start to help them because they're so intelligent. They're educated people. And then they help defeat Germany in World War II. Okay, so right there, diversity helps us quite a bit, but some people are racist, prejudiced, discriminatory. And this is what happens, unfortunately. And sometimes we'll think about how right now there are a lot of people who are foreigners who do want to come to America to contribute to intellect, to education, but they're not being welcomed in our country at the moment. And so we can see how some people are very worried when we see this happening, because we've seen this happen before in our history. Economic strength. If society leaves a group of people out because of prejudice and discrimination, because they're considered inferior or less intelligent, that group will bring less money or have less money to spend buy less, pay less in taxes. So imagine that, right? If you don't have money, you can't spend it. So we want to make sure that everyone has a lot of money. If they're have opportunities, they should be able to have those opportunities to make money. But sometimes people are discriminatory against them, right? So we don't hire a certain group of people. Those people are not going to make as much money as everyone else, so they cannot spend as much. But the companies, they shouldn't care who you are, right? They should just go, I just want your money. Come here over here and buy this stuff. So because of that, we're talking about how society loses out in an economic way. Personal gains. We all gain when we all have money to spend. Access to healthcare, good educational system and opportunities, access to business loans and mortgages. Example, healthcare. When there is no healthcare accessible to everyone, we all pay more for our healthcare. So let's think about this, okay? If there is no healthcare that is accessible to everyone, we actually end up paying more as a society, okay? Some people have healthcare, but they cannot pay. That's part of our society. Insurance will go up to cover the cost of those who cannot pay, right? Because they have to help those people as well, that means that they have to raise the insurance rate of the people who can pay to use part of that money to pay for the people who cannot pay, right? However, if we all have insurance, then we all pay less, okay? People who do not pay for healthcare do not usually visit the doctor until they are really sick. So they're paying for more complicated treatments than they might have if they could just see the doctor on a yearly basis, let's say, right? Other countries pay less for healthcare and have better results. So we are pretty much the only country in the world that is powerful, and we do not have universal healthcare. So the American statistics by the OECD, which is a statistical group, these are some of the information that they found through their statistics. In 2021, spends twice the amount on healthcare compared to other countries. So we spend so much money on healthcare. Only high-income country that does not guarantee health coverage, like we just said before. We're the only leading country in the world with no health care for everyone. Life expectancy is 3 years less than the average, so we die sooner than other countries. Higher rates of infant and maternal deaths, so this is babies and mothers who are delivering who will die because of our health inequality. Obesity rates is twice the average, and then more likely to have multiple chronic conditions. So that means multiple lifelong conditions. So, this is why we hear people talk about health accessibility by some of our politicians, because they know that if everyone has it, we would be a healthier country. Equity. Equality means that each group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. Equity is not equality. It's related to it, right? But it's not. So equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome for all involved. So here's an example, okay? Mara, who is, let's say, a white woman, and Pedro, who is a Latino man, are clients with a specific disease, COPD, right? So equality is each patient sees the same doctor, gets the same tests, and then gets the same free medication. Okay, so that's equality, right? Mara goes home with her medication. She can read the label because it's in English and the paperwork that comes with the medication. Pedro, who does not speak English very well, cannot read the label or the paperwork because it's in English. So do you see how they were both given exactly the same treatment? So that's equality, but one might not necessarily get to understand how to take the medication because they don't speak English, right? So equity would be that if we knew that Pedro did not speak English very well, during the doctor visit, there should be an interpreter, right? And then the label on the medication should be printed in Spanish if we know that they speak Spanish. So that means that then once that happens, then Pedro can read the medication and know when to take it, what the side effects are, and everything, just like Mara. So that would be an equal outcome of taking the medication to help them both with their COPD. So do you see the difference between the two, right? Equality means everyone gets the exact same thing. However, the reality is that not all of us start at the same place. So because he is a Spanish speaker and probably more comfortable in a Spanish speaking environment, having a Spanish interpreter and then write the materials that he's receiving is in Spanish would help him. Okay. I know that you're probably thinking, well, why don't he just use Google Translate or something? That's besides the point, right? We're just talking about in general. Obviously, he can figure those things out now that technology is getting better. But think about this from 20 years ago when we didn't have Google Translate. Okay, how we protect ourselves. We need to look at ourselves. Many of us believe that we are not biased. Here are some ways that we make ourselves think that we are without prejudice. Sometimes we just ignore the fact that we are biased. In this field, we have to admit that we do have biases, okay? In an honest, authentic way, too. All right, colorblind. Some of us may say that we do not see color or that we are colorblind. We might say something like, I don't see color, I only see people. You just don't see black to me is another phrase, right? Let's say we're talking specifically about black people or African American people. This is a way to not see people for who they are. A person's race is part of their unique experience and personal vision. Okay, as someone who is older, right, I want to talk to you really quickly about this phrase, colorblind. So, racism, right, we've been trying to solve racism for a very long time. Back in the 90s or so, 80s, 90s, this is what people used to say all the time. It's like, I don't see color. If you cut us, we all bleed red, right? Because we were trying during that time period to say that we're all equal. Remember how before in the slave times, a slave was 3/5 of a person, right? So we're trying to just say a person is a person, okay? So when you hear older adults like me say that we're colorblind, obviously I don't use this phrase anymore, right? But if you see older adults who say that, don't yell at them so much, okay? Because that's how they were taught. And imagine if they went to high school in the 80s or the 90s or whatever, they never went back to school again. This is how they're thinking, okay? They don't mean any harm, okay? Obviously, race is now thought of in a much more complicated, complex way, an amazing way. I think it's for the better, right? But every generation, we try to figure out how we can kind of like be good, okay? And during olden times, this is what we thought was good. But obviously in today's world, we realize, no, you should, appreciate people for their differences and stuff like that, okay? Again, just don't yell at them if you understand who they're. Obviously have discussions with them if you want to, if it's the right setting, the right time, and you feel safe, right? And also, for I think a younger generation, if they say that, they were probably raised by their parents to say the same thing as well, okay? And there's a whole thing about the melting pot, or are we a salad, which we can talk about in future conversations in class and stuff like that if you want, okay? So again, colorblind, that used to be a good way, but it's really not, because we start to analyze it a lot more. Our conversations have been a lot more deeper and more complex, which is fantastic, right? But again, this is an older time period when people are trying to understand how to talk about race. Minimizing the hurtful experiences of others. People of different races, ethnicities, and religion experience hurtful acts against them all the time. It might be on purpose, or it might not necessarily be on purpose, okay? They are typically aimed at a person from a marginalized group and are hurtful. So what that is saying is sometimes we say things to people of color, right, that we did not realize was hurtful, okay? Microaggressions are typically what we're talking about here. Microaggressions, barely noticeable slights or exclusions that cause emotional pain to the person experiencing them. So I hear people talking about microaggressions in a way where you tell a person a compliment, but it's not really a compliment, even though it sounds like a compliment, okay? So someone who might say something like, you're really pretty for a black person, right? So you're complimenting them, but you're also reminding them, for a black person, not for everyone as a human or whatever, but especially only for black people, because I think that black people are not attractive. That's what it's basically saying, right? And so we need to rethink how we say these things. And we need to also think about why we say certain things and stuff like that. So let's look at some examples. So Cheryl is a black woman who tells her friend Jan, let's say who is a white person, that when she went to the store, the clerk followed her around the store. Jan goes, oh, that happened to me before. And it's probably just happens to a lot of people. It happens to a lot of other people, right? So this response is kind of dismissing what Cheryl is trying to say, which is that oftentimes as a person of color, we are seen as thieves or something like that. Or, we're going to rob someone or steal something or whatever. Um, so microaggressions are typically invisible to the perpetrator. So Jan, when she said that, she probably didn't realize that what she's saying was a microaggression. And sometimes to the recipient, they can feel that way. Okay. All right. Types of microaggressions. Number one, asking people where they're from or where they are born, or telling them that they speak good English. This means that they're seen as foreigners or not Americans. So let's say a person who's Asian, who's been in America since like the 1800s, right? Many generations. Asian people do not typically look like the stereotypical American, right? So often you hear people addressing or asking Asian people, hey, where are you from, right? Whereas other people, like white people, you might not say, hey, where are you from? Because they'll look at you and go, well, I'm from America, duh, right? And it's kind of unfair. And the reason why is because we do not look like the typical white person, let's say, right? A typical American. So we're being, even though the question is very innocent, it isn't, because it's saying that you do not look like us, okay? You do not look American. All right, number two, telling BIPOC. So BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, that they are intelligent or a credit to their race. So telling people like, oh, you're really smart for a Black person, or you're really smart for a Native American, that sounds terrible, because you're saying is like, oh, for a Black person, which we think are not educated at all or not very smart, you are actually the exception to it. So that doesn't necessarily sound very good, right? 3, telling BIPOC person that you don't see color or that there is only one race, the human race. This denies a person's culture and experience. And we've talked about this previously before. 4, actions like crossing the street to avoid a BIPOC person, refusing to get in an elevator, or following a shopper in the store around to make sure that they do not steal implies that BIPOC is a criminal or dangerous, right? So obviously, some of y'all will say, well, I cross the street, for any type of safety reasons. That's fine, right? But there are people who, once they see someone of color, they will do something very intentional, right? So we're not necessarily talking about safety per se, right? Because we can talk about the fact that women tend to cross the street if they see a man, no matter what ethnicity. Maybe not white sometimes, that's debatable. Obviously this is a much more deeper conversation. But typically women will say that because it's a man, right, they won't get into an elevator alone, let's say, whether they are white, Black, Latino, Asian, or Native American, right? So again, the conversation is a lot more complicated than what we're talking about right here. And I just wanted to bring it up so that we're aware of that. I'm not trying to just, push everything to the side in that way. Number 5, saying that you think that the most qualified person, regardless of race, should get the job, or that any person who works hard can get ahead, implies people of color get unfair advantages or are lazy. So some people might associate this with, school applications or diversity, equity, and inclusion type of issues. But you have to think about this in a much more deeper way. We're talking about equity, right? If a group of let's say one group of people of color are not given the same opportunities to learn and be successful, when they compete, they're not necessarily going to be better than a person who has all the advantages, all the opportunities, right? So it's a lot more deeper than just saying the most qualified person, because there are some people who are hardly very qualified, but they never got the education they could have because of their ethnicity. They were put into a part of the neighborhood or this part of the city where the education system is really bad because of the color of their skin, right? So it's a lot more of a deeper conversation when it comes to that. So I hope that you all have that conversation as well amongst each other with your classmates, so you can hear other people's perceptions about this as well. All right, 6, asking BIPOC people to stop being so loud, or asking someone from China why they don't speak up, implies that these people do not fit in here. So what that is saying is that let's not tolerate people's differences of their cultures. Instead, they should all be American, right? Which is what we think is this specific behavior, and you should all behave like that as well. You might hear that in the term code switching, right? Which is, don't talk in, let's say, African American vernacular English, which is kind of like their dialect, right? You should speak in like proper educated English or whatever. That's what people might say, right? So code switching is being able to go from one to the other depending on the circumstance and situation that you are put in. So you might hear people say that professional telephone voice, right? That would be what they're saying here is you need to follow the rules on how to talk. You should have straight hair. You should not have like, an afro or anything like that, because that's not what typical Americans, whatever they describe Americans as, has, right? And that's why you see many people who are black who straighten out their hair because they want to be accepted so that they have the opportunities that other people have. Whether or not they want to or not, unfortunately, sometimes people have to do that to get ahead in life. So that's another conversation that we should have about that. All right, number 7, assuming BIPOC people are service people, such as maids or workers or something like that, referring to BIPOC people as you people as well. So obviously, you should never say you people when you're talking about a specific group of ethnicity, right? Because that's kind of like saying, this was specific group of people tend to have a certain type of behavior or something like that. And no group of person or group of ethnicity will have all the same stuff. You're stereotyping basically, right? And then of course, obviously, if you see someone who's Latino, you should not say, oh, are you like the landscaper, right? Because that's stereotyping again. All right, 8, environmental microaggressions occur when schools in low-income areas are overcrowded or have an overabundance of liquor stores, implies that you do not value education or clean air. So again, because you see how people of certain colors are put into certain neighborhoods, right? Then we stereotype them to have those types of behaviors and stuff like that. All right, refusing to talk about racism. Some of us are uncomfortable discussing racial differences in culture and experience. Very true. Especially, I see that happening in our field, psychology, counseling. So I just want to make sure that I'm hoping that you all feel a little bit more comfortable talking about these things now that we're talking about it here. When I lecture in class, I love to have conversations about it because it's a lot more complicated than you think. And when you're trying to talk about that for the first time, you're going to stumble. You're going to say things that might be seen as, not the greatest things, right? But you're learning at this time. So it's okay. So I hope that you find a safe environment. Obviously, in our classrooms, you're welcome to ask questions and talk about these things. You will stumble, but it's good. You're practicing. Once you practice, you'll be a lot more better, okay? It is a very complicated, very sensitive topic, but it is a topic that we still need to talk about. All right, so here's an example, is that there is a book called 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones. And so they have a bunch of essays in there that outlines the history of Black people in the United States. They talk about enslavement of Black families, which is very, very controversial, right? Very, very, obviously slavery is not a good thing, but it happened, right? So we need to talk about it, even though it is uncomfortable. Failure of the Reconstruction after Civil War. So again, we talked about Civil War, about basically freeing the slaves, and then how did it, what did America become after that, right? Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are basically equal but separate. So this is where the time period where we have water fountains, right? But one is labeled for white people and then one is labeled for Black people. Okay, so we're getting there, sort of, right? It's not so great. It's still terrible, right? But we're moving forward. Okay. Intimidation by the Ku Klux Klan. So we're talking about basically American Nazis, and what they were doing with lynchings and a lot of them were actually in the government. And so they made laws and rules about where people could live and stuff like that, who are people of color. So it's a lot. It's not just like, a rally of some sort. They were going into the systems and manipulating things so that certain people of color were not able to become successful. Civil rights movement, obviously we're talking about like Martin Luther King and stuff like that. And then election of the first Black president, right? The first and only so far. Hopefully we will have more. But yeah, so these are conversations and essays that are some of them are really great successes and some of them are, failed, right? So, and we need to be able to admit that they all exist, good and bad. So these are all informative, but they're also very uncomfortable. to talk about. Some argue that teaching children about slavery and how complicated the history of race is in the country is teaching children to hate this country. Hopefully, children do not hate this country. We need to make sure that they're grounded in reality, right? And this is why sometimes we'll hear about land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements and stuff like that, because we need to remind ourselves that our history is very complicated, but we should be able to admit and understand, accept the fact that things are more complicated than we want to, right? It wasn't like Christopher Columbus discovered America and everyone was really happy, because that's not true. By saying that, we cannot have a conversation about it and make real change for a more united nation. Okay, denial of structural racism. People who deny the existence of structural racism are more likely to exhibit anti-Black prejudice. So remember, structural racism is basically like when it gets a little bit more complicated, like as in the people who are racist go into government, make laws. They might not say that they're racist or whatever, but they bring up issues that are pretty discriminatory, right? And so we need to admit that there are certain things that are systemic, or the system has been corrupted, okay? Less likely to show racial empathy if they are going to do this, and less likely to be open to diversity, okay? Likely to blame the victims of structural racism for not being successful. Then those people in power do not have to do anything to change the structure. They do not have to examine themselves or try to take action for social justice. So again, there are some people in our society who do not see everyone as equal. In the field of psychology or in counseling, we do see that everyone should be treated equally and in an equitable way, because we realize that not everyone starts off exactly the same with the same opportunities and life. Okay, denial of personal racism. Some of us convince ourselves that we are not racist by saying that we are not racist. We offer proof so that we do not have to look at ourselves. Okay, so we might say, oh, well, this is happening, so that's why I'm not racist, right? We tell ourselves that we know a person who is Black, so that therefore we are pretty equal and treating people very fairly. If we convince ourselves that we don't have to participate in anti-racist activities, which is like talking about it, right? So here in this image right here, it's obviously of a picture of a white man and a Black man. How can someone be racist if they have friends who are Black? And then the bottom part says, the same way serial killers have friends who are alive, right? Obviously, this is a meme type of thing, but, we should have that conversation about it, okay? All right, subtle acts of exclusion or microaggressions. So we'll bring back the word microaggression again. There's proof that people who experience microaggressions take a toll on people. When it happens often, the way becomes crushing. So there's a video that's really good about microaggressions as mosquito bites, okay? Every once in a while, if someone gets a microaggression, it's a mosquito bite, we can handle it. But there are certain people who get microaggressions all the time. So if you think about having 10 mosquito bites at one time, that's going to be so itchy and so irritating and so annoying, right? And so this is what happens for certain people, though. And so this is why we talk about the fact that microaggressions are actually more common, and some people don't realize it because I get bit every once in a while. That's fine, right? But other people, unfortunately, do get bit a lot more. Okay, inclusion will not naturally just happen. It will happen when we make sure people feel valued, respected, and part of a group. There are 3 characteristics of microaggressive acts. Number 1 is that they can be subtle or hard to identify. They are acts that happen, and then they also serve to exclude, because they're trying to say is, you're really smart for a Latino, which basically means that typically we don't think Latinos are smart, right? So they're excluding a whole group of people when they say this compliment. Okay. All right. The concepts of strangers, a person whose culture is different from our own and thus open to our misinterpretation. So the textbook is saying is we have to just realize that if a person is different from us, that we could potentially misunderstand them. And that's just a reality, right? And that's true. Everyone that you meet, because they are going to be different in certain ways, you might misunderstand them. Imagine a straight counselor with a gay client, right? There might be some misunderstanding. And that's just what it's saying. It's just very basic, right? We're not trying to ask you to fight this or argue it. Just admit to the fact that you might not understand everything that they're saying. All right. If a person comes from another culture, another country, it is entirely possible that they do not know enough about your culture to be able to really to relate easily to you. Again, makes sense. It is quite likely you do not have enough information about their culture to be able to make the new situation smooth for them. Yeah, but we try, right? We work with them as much as we can. We become educated. We meet people who are different than us because all of that will make us a better person, right? And a person who might be able to connect with other people. We're not expecting everyone to be 100% on everything. That is just too much on us. But the more people that we meet, the more that we learn, we might be a better person because of it. 9 actions to ensure our work with people is helpful. The textbook goes into detail about each of these. I'm just going to read the like kind of like the heading of it, and then I expect you guys all to go read it in the book. All right, number 1, addressing anxiety and uncertainty. Number 2, developing empathy and humility. 3, becoming culturally competent. 4, becoming an uncertainty-oriented person. 5, looking for exceptions. 6, checking your attributions. 7, acknowledging white privilege and white exceptionalism. 8, evaluating scripts. And 9, allowing for differences. I'll say some really quickly things, right? So you should be able to admit that sometimes people make you nervous or scared because you don't know them. It's totally fine. 2, developing an empathy and humility, so that's practice, to be able to understand them, meet them, and see where they are and kind of, be in their shoes, but also be able to explain that feeling. Becoming culturally competent, which means learning about diversity. 4, becoming uncertainty-oriented person. So again, remember, we just talked about this before, is the fact that when you meet someone, you need to admit that you don't know them perfectly. You don't know everything about them. 5, looking for exceptions. So again, that I believe that's talking about is how to break down stereotypes, right? Because stereotypes are usually kind of a mass understanding of a group of people, but not everyone's like that. 6, checking for your attribution. So where do you come from as a person? Recognizing your biases and stuff. Acknowledging white privilege and white exceptionalism. We talked about that with microaggressions, right? Evaluating scripts. So sometimes we have certain ideas in our head that we think are true, right? And we automatically just think them. So now we're talking about is examining those things and correcting them. And then, of course, allowing for differences, basically celebrating diversity and stuff like that. All right, we're done with this chapter. Bye.